The Kethvar Council of Seven had a saying, older than their written history: when the pale ones go quiet, the galaxy breathes again. They had been breathing for 240 years. High Arbiter Solvan Dres stood at the curved obsidian viewport of the Eternal Conclave Station, floating in high orbit above the lush emerald world of Kethvara Prime. Behind him, the 7 seats of the ruling council glowed with the bioluminescent patterns of his kind, tall four-armed beings with translucent silver skin and eyes like fractured moons. They were elegant, ancient, certain that humanity was dead. The evidence had been overwhelming. 243 years ago, the Kethvar Grand Armada, 2,000 warships, the greatest fleet ever assembled in the known galaxy, had surrounded the human home system. They had seeded the asteroid belt with resonance bombs. They had collapsed the transit gates. They had salted every relay beacon with kill signal pulses, and then, with all the cold efficiency of a people who had been preparing this moment for 3 decades, they had wrapped the entire Sol system in a quantum communications blackout. They had not fired a single weapon. They hadn't needed to. Humanity, that brash and burning species that had exploded across 40 star systems in barely 3 centuries, had been cut off from its colonies, cut off from resources, cut off from trade. The Kethvar had simply closed the door, left them sealed inside their own solar system like insects in a jar. The colonies had crumbled without Earth's coordination. The human frontier had collapsed inward like a dying star. Within 30 years, the last human colony ship had gone silent. Within 50, even the radio ghosts had faded. Humanity had simply stopped. High Arbiter Solvan Dres turned from the viewport and folded 2 of his 4 hands behind his back. The Meridian Compact arrives in 6 rotations, he announced to the Council. They come to formalize humanity's star systems as unclaimed territory. The frontier worlds will be redistributed. Sol system itself will become a heritage zone, a monument to what happens when a species overreaches. The Council hummed in satisfied agreement. Sub-Arbiter Veth Alan, youngest of the 7 and the only one who had ever actually encountered a living human, pressed her fingers together. Has anyone verified the blackout is still holding? The resonance network requires maintenance. Sub-Arbiter. Solvan's voice carried the gentle weight of absolute authority. The humans are gone. They have been gone for nearly 2.5 centuries. We have won. Do not resurrect ghosts on the eve of celebration. Vethalan said nothing, but she looked at the star charts and she thought about the Halveth Nebula, that vast crimson cloud of ionized gas and stellar dust, 50 light-years wide, that wrapped around the far edge of the old human frontier like a bloody shroud. The Kethvar had never fully mapped the interior of the Halveth Nebula. The interference was too dense. Sensors couldn't penetrate more than a few light-years into the cloud. She thought about that. She thought about it for a long time. Then the emergency channel screamed. Every screen in the Eternal Conclave blazed red. The voice that came through was not one of their own. It was not Meridian Compact. It was not any species in the known registry. The universal translation matrix struggled for 2 full seconds, an eternity for a system that could parse 400 languages simultaneously, before it finally rendered the words. And when it did, High Arbiter Solvan Dres felt something he had not felt in 200 years of absolute power. Fear. The voice was calm, measured, almost gentle, like someone who had been practicing exactly what they were going to say for a very, very long time. This is Fleet Admiral Mara Voss of the Human Reclamation Navy, transmitting from the Halveth Nebula perimeter on all frequencies. To the Kethvar Council of 7. We received your silence. We understood your message. We have prepared our reply. On every sensor screen, every tracking station, every orbital telescope pointed toward the Halveth Nebula, something was changing. The nebula was moving. Not the gas, not the dust. Something inside it. 10,000 somethings. Steel-hulled, reactor-hot, armed. 10,000 warships emerged from the Halveth Nebula, like a fist unclenching after 240 years. Humanity had not died. Humanity had been building. 243 years earlier, A woman named Director General Una Park had stood in the Global Emergency Council chambers in Geneva and listened to the last transmission from the HFY Armada. The message had been brief, almost dismissive. A legal notice of quarantine. A declaration that humanity was a destabilizing species. That its expansion had been judged a threat to galactic order. That the Sol system transit gates were being permanently closed. That any human vessel attempting to breach the cordon would be destroyed. The generals had wanted to fight. With 800 warships spread across 40 systems, humanity had real military power. They could bleed the HFY, make it costly. Una Park had told them to sit down. "If we fight now," she said, her voice carrying the eerie calm of someone who had already played this game to its conclusion in her mind, "we lose, not because we're weak, because we're scattered. They've already cut the communications. Our colonies don't even know what's happening. We cannot coordinate a war, we cannot communicate." "Then what do we do?" demanded General Osei Mensa, the commander of Earth's home fleet. "We submit? We die quietly?" "No," said Una Park. She pulled up a star chart. Her finger traced the great crimson mass of the Halveth Nebula. "We disappear, and while they celebrate, we build something they can't see, can't scan, and cannot imagine." The plan was called Operation Lazarus. Over the following decade, as the HFY blockade settled into comfortable routine, and the galaxy began to accept that humanity was fading, Earth quietly dismantled itself. Not in defeat, in transformation. The great manufacturing complexes were disassembled and their components scattered across unmarked cargo haulers. The most brilliant engineers, physicists, military strategists, biologists, and architects were loaded aboard generation ships under cover of debris fields and electromagnetic false signatures. They slipped through the blockade one vessel at a time. Some were caught, many were not. And in the deep dark interior of the Halveth Nebula, where sensor pulses scattered like light through broken glass, humanity began to build. They named their first station Lazarus Prime. It was not beautiful. It was barely livable. Carved into the iron heart of a captured asteroid, it smelled of recycled air and machine oil, and the particular desperation of people who know the universe has declared them extinct and have decided collectively to make the universe wrong about that. Una Park died there, 41 years into the exile, an old woman surrounded by the grandchildren of people she had saved. Her last words, reportedly, were practical ones. "Tell the Navy the third reactor array needs better shielding." But she had left behind something more than instructions. She had left behind a culture, a philosophy of waiting that was also a philosophy of fury. Inside the Halveth Nebula, humanity did not grieve. It remembered. Every child born in the nebula stations learned the same history, not as mythology, as engineering specification. They learned exactly how the HFY blockade worked. They learned the exact frequencies of the resonance bomb network. They learned the precise orbital mechanics of every HFY military station. They learned the personal histories of the 7 arbiters who had ordered the quarantine, and of every arbiter who had voted to maintain it in the 2 centuries since. They learned how to be patient, and they learned how to be devastating. By the 5th generation, Lazarus Prime had become Lazarus System. 7 stations, 3 shipyards, and a population of 11 million. By the 8th generation, the Human Reclamation Navy had its first 100 warships. By the 12th generation, they had 1,000. They did not rush. They had waited this long. They could wait until they were ready. They waited until they had 10,000 ships. Then they waited a little longer, studied a little more, ran the simulations until every commander could execute the battle plan in their sleep. Fleet Admiral Mara Voss was the 15th generation descendant of a cargo pilot who had slipped through the blockade with 17 families hidden in false-bottomed shipping containers. She had grown up on Lazarus III, breathing recycled air and listening to her grandmother's grandmother's recorded voice describe the sky over what had once been Cape Town. She had never seen a sky, not a natural one. She had spent her entire 46 years of life in the dark of the Halveth Nebula, preparing for the moment she could see one. When the Council of Admirals voted unanimously to begin Operation Reclamation, Mara Voss gave the order personally. Her voice, transmitted across the fleet, was not triumphant. It was not theatrical. It was the voice of someone completing a very long piece of work. All ships, advance. 10,000 warships began to move. The Kethvar Grand Defense Fleet scrambled in chaos. They had 4,000 warships in the region. It should have been enough. By any conventional calculus, it should have been more than enough. The Kethvar had spent 2.5 centuries refining their military technology, upgrading their weapon systems, training new generations of commanders. What they had not done was train against an enemy that knew everything about them. The Human Reclamation Navy's opening salvo was not aimed at ships. It was aimed at infrastructure. The resonance bomb network that had kept Sol system isolated for 240 years, the same network whose specifications humanity had spent 2 centuries memorizing, detonated inward in a cascading chain of precisely calculated counter-frequencies, not explosions, not destruction, simply nullification. The bombs canceled each other out, one by one, like dominoes falling in a sequence that had been planned in a classroom on Lazarus III by a 17-year-old military engineering student 30 years ago. The blockade fell in 11 minutes. Kethvar Fleet Admiral Rin Tassak watched his sensor displays with the specific horror of a commander who has just realized that everything he knows is wrong. The human ships were not fighting the way the tactical models predicted. They were not charging in emotional human fury, guns blazing. They were surgical, methodical, every move accounted for. They were fighting like people who had been planning this battle for longer than he had been alive. Because they had been. Strike Group Omega, 800 warships, broke off from the main fleet and hit the Kethvar communications relay network, not to destroy it, to capture it. The Human Signals Corps had spent decades cracking Kethvar encryption. Within an hour of the battle's opening, Fleet Admiral Voss was reading Kethvar tactical orders as they were transmitted. Strike Group Sigma targeted the fuel depots, not the warships, the fuel depots. Every resupply station, every orbital platform, every tender vessel, the Kethvar warships could fight for days on internal reserves. After that, they would be extremely expensive debris. Strike Group Alpha, flagship Adamantine with Mara Voss aboard, went straight for the Eternal Conclave station. High Arbiter Solvan Dress watched them come and understood, with the slow clarity of catastrophic revelation, that he had made a terrible miscalculation. He had assumed that 200 years of isolation would break humanity, that without resources, without contact with the wider galaxy, a species could not thrive, could not advance, could not sustain the will to fight. He had forgotten one thing: humans had motive. The battle for the Kethvar frontier lasted 18 days. The Kethvar fought hard. They were not cowards, and they were not stupid. They adapted. They improvised. But they were fighting an enemy that had studied them for 2 centuries, while the Kethvar had spent those same 2 centuries studying no one. One by one, the Kethvar defense lines folded. There were moments of terrible cost. Strike Group Gamma was ambushed at the Kethvar 2nd Fleet Station and lost 60 ships in 4 hours of brutal close-range fighting. Commander Tiago Souza of the destroyer Unbroken died holding a corridor so that 3,000 troops could reach their evacuation craft. His ship's logs, recovered later, showed he had been reciting the names of the 17 families his ancestor had smuggled through the blockade. He recited all 17 names before the end, but when it was over, when the last Kethvar defense station lowered its shields and the emergency ceasefire signal rang across the sector, the math was not close. The Human Reclamation Navy had lost 412 ships. The Kethvar had lost 3,160. And the Eternal Conclave Station, seat of the most powerful government in the known galaxy, had an Adamantine-class dreadnought docked at its primary airlock. Fleet Admiral Mara Voss stepped through the airlock door personally. She carried no weapon. She had not brought a security detail. She walked through the halls of the Eternal Conclave alone, her boots ringing on polished alien stone, and she thought about the sky over Cape Town that she had only ever heard described in recordings. She found the Council of 7 in the council chamber, all 7 of them, They had not fled. To their credit, and Mara Voss gave them this credit, they had not fled. High Arbiter Sylvan Dres rose as she entered. He was older than she'd expected, more fragile-looking. She reminded herself that this man had been an adult when the blockade was imposed. He was one of perhaps 24 living Kethvar who had actually voted to seal humanity inside its own solar system and leave it to die. He spread all four of his hands, the Kethvar gesture of yielding. "Admiral," he said. His translated voice was carefully neutral. "You have won." "Yes," said Mara Voss. "We have." "What are your terms?" Mara Voss reached into her uniform jacket and placed a single document on the council table. It was old. The paper was yellowed, the print faded. It had been printed on Lazarus Prime in the 3rd year of the exile and passed down through 15 generations of military commanders, always kept in the possession of whoever would one day lead the fleet home. "These are not my terms," she said. "These are humanity's terms. They were written by Director General Una Park 240 years ago, 1 month after the blockade began. She wrote them because she believed, despite everything, that this day would come. Read them carefully. Every word is deliberate." The Arbiter read. His expression did not change. But his secondary hands, the ones whose movements Kethvar could not control under emotional duress, curled slowly into fists. Because Una Park's terms were not a demand for conquest, not an order for reparations, not a call for the destruction of the Kethvar civilization. They were something far more difficult to argue against. They were reasonable. The terms Una Park had written in the 3rd year of the exile were 12 pages long and covered everything. Dissolution of the transit gate blockade, immediate and permanent. Recognition of human sovereignty over Sol system and all former human frontier worlds. A seat for humanity on the Galactic Compact Council, the same body the Kethvar had dominated for 3 centuries. Reparations, yes, but structured as a fund for rebuilding human colonial infrastructure rather than as a punitive payment. War crimes tribunals for the specific individuals who had planned and executed the blockade, but not collective punishment of the Kethvar people. And one final clause that the Arbiter read 3 times, convinced he was misunderstanding the translation. A joint memorial, to be constructed at the border of what was the blockade zone, dedicated to the dead of both sides, of all the generations of this conflict, with a single inscription. This is what happens when the powerful choose fear over justice. Let no species forget it. "You want a monument," the Arbiter said slowly, "that includes our dead." "We want a monument that tells the truth," said Mara Voss. "Your soldiers who died in this war believed they were defending their civilization. Most of them were not old enough to have voted for the blockade. The monument is for them too. The crime belonged to governments, not to people." She looked at him steadily. "Unlike what was done to us." The Arbiter was quiet for a long time. "You prepared for 240 years, he said finally, "and your terms are diplomatic." "We prepared for 240 years, said Mara Voss, "which is exactly why our terms can afford to be. We do not need revenge. We have already won everything that matters. What we need now is a galaxy that won't do this again." She gathered the document from the table. "You have 72 hours to sign. If you don't, we resume operations, but I think you'll sign." She paused at the door. "Sub-Arbiter Veth Alan, she should be at the table for these discussions." She was the only one who looked at a star chart and wondered. That kind of instinct is worth preserving. Then Fleet Admiral Mara Voss walked back to her ship. The Kethvar signed in 31 hours. 3 months later, the transit gate at the edge of Sol system opened for the first time in 243 years. Mara Voss's fleet came through first, not in battle formation, but in the old way, the civilian way, ships spread wide and running lights blazing, the way humanity had once crossed space when it still believed the galaxy was open to it. She stood at the viewport of the Adamantine as they crossed into Sol system and saw, for the first time in her life, a sun. Not a nebula star, not the dim filtered glow that leaked through the Halveth gas clouds. A real sun. Sol, her people's son. Her second-in-command, Captain James Afalabi, whose family had been among the original evacuees, stood beside her and said nothing for several minutes. Is that what yellow looks like? He finally asked. Apparently, said Mara Voss. Earth was not what the histories had promised. 240 years without the resource networks had taken their toll. The great cities were reduced. The population that remained, those who had not made it into the exile ships, had survived, but in a world scaled down, quieter, harder. They had not built fleets. They had not planned campaigns. They had simply endured, generation after generation, in the stubborn human way, tending what remained and waiting for something they were not even sure would come. When the fleet arrived, the people on the ground did not cheer immediately. They looked up at 10,000 ships filling the sky and, for one terrible moment, feared another blockade. Then the hailing frequency opened and a voice said, in Old English that any human would recognize, "This is Fleet Admiral Mara Voss. We're home. You don't have to be afraid anymore. We're bringing everyone home." The cheering started at the coast of what had been called Cape Town. It spread north and east and west and didn't stop for 3 days. Later, years later, when the rebuilding was well underway and the memorial at the old blockade boundary had been constructed, and the first joint human Keth-Var diplomatic missions were beginning to change the texture of galactic politics, a historian asked Fleet Admiral Voss what she thought had been humanity's true weapon. Not the ships, not the planning. The deeper thing, Mara Voss thought for a long time. Spite, she said at last. Not the ugly kind, the productive kind, the kind that says, you can shut us out, cut us off, leave us in the dark, and we will use every single second of that darkness to become something you can't stop. That's not hatred, that's just humans being humans. She smiled then. A small, satisfied smile. We're very good at it. The Valdris Imperium had conquered 412 worlds. Not metaphorically, not diplomatically. 412 civilizations had looked up at their skies, seen the shadow of the Imperial Armada blotting out their suns, and within a standard galactic cycle, submitted, surrendered, or ceased to exist entirely. The math was simple. The Valdris didn't negotiate. They calculated. They had war models older than most species' written languages. They had predictive algorithms that could simulate the military response of any civilization within a margin of error so small it was essentially zero. They fed a species biology, population density, resource output, territorial instinct, and technological threshold into the Dominion engine. And it told them exactly how long the war would take, how many casualties they would absorb, and what the optimal extraction rate of the conquered world would be post-pacification. In 412 conquests, the Dominion engine had never been wrong, not once. So when the Valdris turned their expansion vector toward a small, oxygen-rich world in a minor spiral arm, a world the locals called Earth, Supreme Executor Vile Dorn fed the data into the engine with the casual indifference of a man signing paperwork. The humans were young, barely 6,000 years of recorded civilization. Their fastest ships couldn't break past the edge of their own solar system with any reliable consistency. Their weapons were kinetic-based, chemically propelled, laughably primitive by imperial standards. They had no unified planetary government. They were still fractured into hundreds of squabbling nation-states. The engine processed, calculated, rendered. Projected pacification timeline, 14 standard cycles. Projected imperial casualties, 0.003% of deployed force. Recommended force deployment, 2 Dominion battle groups. Confidence interval, 99.97%. Vildorn had barely glanced at the readout. 14 cycles, practically a training exercise. He assigned it to Tactical Commander Sarathol, a young, ambitious officer who needed a simple conquest to pad his service record before being assigned to the real campaigns on the Outer Rim. The kind of mission where a commander could look competent without breaking a sweat. 2 battle groups, 47 warships, 90,000 Valdris assault troops, against one small, divided, primitive world. It should have been over before it started. The first signal came in on Cycle 3. Sarath-Ul was reviewing extraction projections for the human northern continent when his communication officer, a pale-crested Valdris named Orveth, went unusually quiet at his station. Commander. Sarath-Ul didn't look up. Report. The ground teams in Sector Ven have stopped transmitting. He looked up then. All of them? Yes, Commander. All 43 ground teams in Sector Ven simultaneously. Sarathul set down his data slate very slowly. 43 teams didn't go silent simultaneously from equipment failure. Last known transmission? Orveth's crest flattened, the Valdris equivalent of a deep frown. They were reporting routine pacification operations. Local resistance had been minimal. Then, he paused, his voice dropping half a register. Then one of them transmitted a single phrase before the signal cut. What phrase? Orveth looked at his commander with the expression of someone who very badly did not want to say the next words out loud. They're not running. The command bridge went very, very quiet. In 412 conquests, the Valdris ground forces had a universal experience. Every species, every civilization, every culture, when confronted with Imperial assault troops, their technology, their numbers, their absolute ferocity, ran. It was not cowardice. It was biology. Every sentient species in the known galaxy had a survival mechanism that recognized an overwhelming predator and screamed escape. Every species had that mechanism. Sarathul stood up slowly from his command chair. Get me visual on Sector Ven. That's the other problem, Commander. Orveth's voice was barely above a whisper now. The orbital observation platforms over Sector Ven are also offline. Offline. Destroyed, sir. Something came up from the surface and destroyed them. But our sensors can't identify the launch signature. It doesn't match any human weapon system in our database. Sarathul stared at him. Any weapon system? Any system we have on record, Commander. Whatever took out those platforms, and we don't know what it is. The Supreme Commander of 2 Valdris battle groups stood on the bridge of the most powerful warship in the sector, and felt, for the first time in his decorated career, something cold move through his chest. He pulled up the intelligence dossier on Earth again. Read it from the beginning this time. Not skimming. Reading. His eyes stopped on a passage he had ignored the first time. A cultural note filed by a xenosociologist in the pre-invasion assessment team. The kind of soft science commentary that tactical commanders routinely dismissed. Note of interest. Humans are the only species in our survey catalog that has, at various points in their history, deliberately trained specific members of their population not to suppress their violent threat response, but to amplify it. They have cultural institutions, spanning thousands of years, dedicated to producing individuals in whom the survival flight instinct has been systematically inverted. These individuals do not run from danger. They have been conditioned, through processes that vary by culture and era, but share remarkable functional consistency, to move toward it. Furthermore, and this analyst considers this the most significant finding in the entire assessment, the humans do not consider this unusual. They celebrate it. They name these individuals, construct mythology around them, grant them status and resources. In every other species surveyed, such individuals would be classified as neurologically aberrant. Among humans, they are the ones placed in charge of defense. Recommendation: adjust confidence interval. This variable has not been adequately weighted. Sarathul read it twice. Then he opened a direct channel to Supreme Executor Vile Dorn. Sir, he said, I think we may have made an error. 3 weeks before the Valdris fleet entered Earth's solar system, a man named Marcus Hale was sitting in a classified briefing room somewhere beneath a mountain range that doesn't appear on any publicly available map. He was 38 years old. He had no social media presence, no public records past the age of 19, and 3 passports, all in different names. His file, had anyone outside the room been cleared to read it, contained a psychological evaluation that used the word anomalous 14 times in 11 pages. Across the table from him sat 11 other people. They did not look like soldiers. That was the first thing anyone who stumbled into that room by accident would have noticed. Soldiers have a particular kind of stillness, a discipline, a rigidity, a posture that speaks of hierarchy, absorbed into bone. The people in this room had stillness too, but it was a different kind entirely. the stillness of something that has stopped pretending. Their names in the official documentation were listed as unit designation, Chimera. 12 individuals drawn from programs that officially did not exist, recruited through channels that officially had never operated, trained in facilities that officially had never been built. The woman at the head of the table was Colonel Yara Vasquez. She had no official rank because her branch of service had no official name. What she had instead was 17 years of operational history in places where conventional military presence was considered too visible, too accountable, or too human. She looked around the table at the 11 people in front of her. The Valdris Imperium, she said, has conquered 412 worlds. Their invasion model assumes that every civilization they encounter will respond to overwhelming force the same way, with panic, fragmentation, and eventual collapse. She paused. That model has never failed. Nobody at the table said anything. They had been briefed on the fleet in orbit, the numbers, the firepower, the casualty projections if Earth attempted a conventional military response. They had all read the numbers. None of them looked particularly concerned. That, Vasquez reflected, was precisely why they were in this room. Every nation contributing to this operation has submitted its best, she continued. Special operations veterans, intelligence operatives, psychological warfare specialists, people who have spent careers learning to operate in environments where the expected response is not available to them. She let that sit for a moment. The Valdris have a war model built on pattern recognition. They've seen hundreds of species. They've cataloged every possible variation of organized resistance. She looked around the table one more time. They have never seen us. What the Valdris had not understood, what their war model had catastrophically failed to weight, was the specific product of human history. Most civilizations, when they developed warfare, developed it as an extension of territorial instinct. They built armies, hierarchies, systems of organized force that could be mapped, predicted, countered. The Valdris had conquered armies. They were very good at it. But humans had not only built armies. Over 10,000 years of recorded conflict, a small subset of humanity had gone somewhere else entirely. Not bigger armies, not more powerful weapons. Something stranger, more dangerous, and far harder to model. Call it what the recruiting files called it. Asymmetric persistence, the capacity to continue operating, effectively, creatively, lethally, in conditions that would render conventional military units non-functional. No supply lines, no chain of command, no tactical certainty, no safe direction, no reliable intelligence, no reasonable expectation of survival. Not just tolerating those conditions, preferring them, because in chaos, pattern recognition-based war models stop working. And the people in that room had spent their entire careers learning to generate chaos. Corporal Jinsu Park had once spent 41 days alone behind enemy lines in a region without resupply, communications, or extraction possibility, and had come out the other side having completed his mission and, by his own account in the debrief, feeling clearer than he had in years. Sergeant Amara Ose had been captured twice by hostile forces. She had escaped both times, and neither facility had been functional afterwards. The psychological evaluation after the second incident had noted, with visible professional discomfort, that her stress cortisol levels during captivity had been lower than baseline. Warrant Officer Dmitry Varenkov communicated primarily through gesture and expression. When he did speak, it was in short declarative sentences. His evaluations contained phrases like, does not experience threat stimuli in a normative fashion, and recommend further study before standard deployment. He had been in Chimera for 9 years. Lieutenant Seo Yeon Kwan had a doctorate in cognitive systems from a university she had never attended, in a name she no longer used. She had also, at some point in her career, talked her way out of 3 different execution orders using 3 different languages, one of which she had learned during the 48 hours preceding each incident, respectively. These were not extraordinary people by normal metrics. By normal metrics, several of them would have required significant intervention. But on a planet being approached by an alien empire with a 99.97% confidence interval, normal metrics were the least useful thing available. The Valdris made landfall on the European continent first. It was a strategic choice. Dense population, multiple centers of political power, high visibility. The kind of landing that broke morale. Imperial doctrine called it impression strike. Overwhelming force deployed in the most psychologically significant location to trigger cascading civilian panic and governmental collapse. It worked. It always worked. The human governments fractured exactly as projected. Emergency broadcasts, competing evacuation orders, political leaders contradicting each other. The civilian population flooded transport networks. Communications went to static in the targeted zones. The Dominion engine processed the data feeds and returned a satisfied status. Pacification, proceeding within projected parameters. The first 3 Valdris assault groups moved into the city centers. 48 hours of impression strike, then a broadcast offering surrender terms, generous by imperial standards, deliberately so because a fast capitulation was more efficient than prolonged resistance. 48 hours passed. The surrender broadcast went out. Silence. Not the silence of capitulation, not the silence of communication infrastructure collapse. The comms were working fine. The Valdris were monitoring them. The silence was human governments looking at each other and apparently deciding not to answer. Sarathul found this baffling. Run the behavioral model again. Already run, sir. Confidence interval unchanged. The projection indicates a response within the next 6 standard hours. They may simply need more time to organize the formal transmission. He nodded, waited. 6 hours later, the response came. Not from a government, not from a military command structure, from the ground, from inside the controlled zones. The assault team commander in the Brussels sector filed the report with shaking hands. Metaphorically speaking, since Valdris anatomy didn't quite work that way, but the behavioral equivalent was unmistakable. His name was Subcommander Vel Arak, and he had been on 11 pacification campaigns. He was not inexperienced. What had happened in the Brussels sector had no precedent in his 11 campaigns. His forces had established a perimeter, standard grid, every road in and out monitored. The local population had been contained in the central district, an efficient arrangement, familiar from a dozen other worlds. Then, over a period of approximately 6 hours, 17 of his soldiers had simply disappeared, not retreated from, not fled by, disappeared. No bodies, no evidence of engagement, no noise, no weapon signatures, no indication of a firefight. His men had been standing their posts, and then they had not been standing their posts, and there was nothing in between those 2 states that his sensors could detect. And then, and this was the part of the report that made Sarathul read it 3 times to make sure he had the translation correct. The humans had given them back. Not killed, not prisoners. Returned. Left at the perimeter. Alive. Unharmed. Except that every single one of them had been stripped of their weapons, their communications equipment, their tactical armor, and their unit identification. They had been returned in their underlayer clothing, disoriented, with no memory of the interval between disappearing and reappearing. And attached to the tunic of each returned soldier, in the Valdris written language, in characters precise enough to have been penned by someone who had studied it, was a single sentence, the same sentence, on all 17. We found your soldiers. We are returning them. Next time, we will not. Colonel Vasquez stood in a drainage tunnel beneath what had been, until 72 hours ago, an occupied city center. Around her, 11 people were doing various things with the quiet, unhurried focus of individuals who considered the current situation entirely manageable. Park was reassembling a piece of Valdris communications equipment with the practiced ease of a man who had spent the previous 4 hours learning to read alien firmware architecture. Quan was translating a Valdris tactical codebook she had acquired. The report didn't specify how, in the past 18 hours. Varenkov was asleep, deliberately and without apology, because he had a 4-hour window before his next operational tasking, and he used available time efficiently. Status, Vasquez said. Osei looked up from her position near the tunnel access. Asset network is operational in all 5 sectors. Contact established with 43 local civilian nodes. Supply corridor to the northern route is open. Their orbital scan frequency. Every 4 minutes, 11 seconds, we have mapped the blind spots. They're consistent. Their scanning protocol is standardized, not adaptive. Vasquez absorbed this. Of course it is. She said it not with contempt, but with something closer to professional recognition. 412 worlds, and it's always worked. No reason to make it adaptive. This was the thing that the Dominion engine had failed to calculate. Not the firepower, not the numbers, not even the specific individuals, remarkable as they were. The orientation. The Valdris built their war model on the assumption that every species when invaded was trying to stop the invasion. The natural, logical response to an overwhelming force was to find a way to match it, overpower it, push it back. That was not what Chimera was doing. They were not trying to win a war. They were not even trying to fight one in the conventional sense. They were trying to make the war unnavigable. Every move they made was designed not to destroy Valdris forces, but to destroy Valdris certainty. To take a war model built on pattern recognition and introduce so much noise, so much contradiction, so many variables that fell outside the predicted range, that the model simply stopped producing reliable outputs. 17 soldiers returned in their underwear, alive and unharmed, told the Valdris nothing about what had happened to them. But it told them something far more destabilizing, that the enemy had decided to return them, which meant the enemy had made a choice, which meant the enemy was operating with a goal that wasn't immediately legible. An enemy you couldn't read was an enemy you couldn't model. And an enemy you couldn't model was the one thing in 412 campaigns the Valdris had never encountered. Sarath Ul called an emergency command council on Cycle 6. His senior commanders were arrayed around the tactical display, a holographic representation of the occupied zones, updated in real time with sensor data. From orbit, it looked controlled. The grid was maintained, the perimeters were holding, the civilian population was contained. But the data inside the perimeters was increasingly difficult to interpret. 17 additional soldiers missing from Sector Gamma, said his intelligence officer Subcommander Rethvalin. None recovered this time. No message, no indication of method. They were present at 0400, absent by 0600. The communications relay in Sector Delta? Destroyed. The replacement was destroyed within 40 minutes of installation. The secondary replacement was destroyed within 20 minutes. We have no communication capability in that sector. A pause. We also believe our channel encryption has been compromised, but we cannot confirm this because anything we transmit on that channel to confirm the compromise would itself be compromised. The food supply depot in Sector Vane? Rethvalin hesitated. Among the Valdris, hesitation was unusual. It indicated processing difficulty, a situation where available data was insufficient to produce a conclusion. The depot is functional, intact. However, we recommend against using it. Why? Another hesitation. Because we do not know how it remained intact. Everything around it in a 300-unit radius was damaged in the night operation. The depot itself was untouched, which is either an oversight on the part of the attackers, she paused, or it is not an oversight. Sarathol stared at the display. They left the food supply deliberately. We believe so. To make us uncertain whether it's safe. Yes. He looked at the hologram for a long time. Run a consumption risk analysis. Already done. The analysis indicates a 34% probability the depot has been compromised in some fashion. But the analysis is based on standard interference patterns, and these attackers have not been following standard patterns. Adjusting for unknown variables, the true probability range is between 12% and 71%. That's not an analysis, that's a shrug. Yes, Commander, it is. What the Valdris were experiencing had a name in human military theory. Vasquez had studied it for 20 years. It was older than any weapon system, older than any technology, as old as human conflict itself. Psychological attrition, not the destruction of an enemy's forces, the destruction of an enemy's will to continue. The systematic erosion of confidence, certainty, and the sense that the war was manageable. You couldn't fight what you couldn't find. You couldn't plan against what you couldn't predict. You couldn't maintain morale in forces that didn't know where the threat was coming from, how many there were, what they wanted, or what the rules of engagement were. The Valdres had landed 90,000 troops. Chimera had 12 people. And every single day, the Valdres war model diverged further from observed reality. On Cycle 9, a Valdres unit in the northern sector encountered something they filed as contact with hostile personnel, and then, in the same report, spent 6 paragraphs struggling to accurately describe. They had been moving through a cleared residential district. All civilians removed, all structures checked, all routes mapped. A standard patrol. They had done 100 of them since landing. They heard music, human music, a single instrument, something unfamiliar to them, melodic and unhurried, coming from inside a building they had cleared 6 hours prior. Doctrine said, investigate, suppress, report. 12 soldiers entered the building. The music stopped. 4 minutes later, 8 of the 12 came back out. The other 4 did not come out. The 8 who returned could not describe what had happened to the 4 who hadn't, not because they were being uncooperative, but because, as their debrief established beyond reasonable doubt, they genuinely did not know. They had been in the same room. The 4 had simply ceased to be present. But here was the part of the report that Sarath-ul read 4 times. The 8 who returned were, by every measurable metric, physically unharmed. But in the debrief, every one of them used the same unprompted phrase when asked to describe the experience. In 8 different soldiers, without coordination, in separate debrief sessions. They were watching us the whole time. Not we were attacked. Not they ambushed us. They were watching us the whole time, as if the entire patrol had been, from beginning to end, observed, studied. As if every Valdres soldier in that district had been walking through someone else's intelligence operation without knowing it. The psychological effect on the unit was not catalogued by any Valdres measurement system, because Valdres measurement systems did not have a category for it. What the unit had experienced, a human psychologist would have identified immediately. They had felt hunted. On Cycle 11, Sarath-ul did something no Valdres commander in 412 campaigns had ever done. He broadcast a request for direct communication, not surrender terms, not ultimatum. A request. He used the human linguistic databases captured in the first landing cycle, and he transmitted on every available frequency a message in 11 human languages. I wish to speak with your commanders. For 18 hours, there was no response. Then, on a frequency he hadn't transmitted on, a frequency that, according to his communications officer, his fleet was not currently monitoring, which meant whoever was transmitting it had known his scanning pattern well enough to find a gap in it. A single voice came through. Human, female, unhurried. You don't have commanders in your database for us. Sarath-ul leaned forward in his command chair. Then who am I speaking to? A pause. Not hesitation, consideration. The people your model didn't account for. I have become aware, he said carefully, that my operational projections were inaccurate. Yes. I would like to understand why. The voice was quiet for a moment. When it spoke again, there was something in its tone that he couldn't quite categorize. Not hostility, not gloating. Something more like a teacher with a student who had finally asked the right question. You built a model. 412 worlds. Every species in your catalog sent you their armies, their soldiers, people trained to fight, and also trained to stop fighting when the math stopped working, when the losses got too high, when the supplies ran out, when the chain of command fractured. Yes, Sarath-ul said. That is correct. We didn't send those people. He waited. Every species you've conquered has soldiers. They're the people a civilization builds to protect itself, trained to use force, but also trained to know when force isn't working, and to report that up the chain so someone can make a decision. Yes. We have those people too, we didn't send them. A pause. We sent the ones that don't report it up the chain, the ones that don't stop when the math stops working, the ones who have been specifically prepared over years For the condition you created. No supply lines, no communications, no tactical certainty, no clear chain of command. Operating inside an occupied zone against a technologically superior force. Sarath-ul said nothing. He was listening very carefully. You wanted a war. Your model told you what that would look like. You expected soldiers because every other species you've faced has sent soldiers. What you got instead was something your model has no category for. And what is that? The answer came without hesitation. People for whom this is normal. Sarath-ul sat with that for a long time after the channel closed. He pulled up the Dominion engine's original projection. Confidence interval, 99.97%. He looked at the assumptions embedded in that number. Every one of them logical. Every one of them drawn from a robust dataset. Every one of them assuming that the humans would respond to invasion the way every other species had. The Dominion engine didn't have a failure mode for an enemy that welcomed the conditions of asymmetric occupation. It had no category for combatants whose training was specifically designed for the exact scenario the Valdris had created. A populated zone, denied to conventional forces, with degraded communications and no clear front line. Because no species had ever sent those people. No species had ever had those people, or if they had recognized what they were, and put them specifically in charge of this. He opened a direct channel to Supreme Executor Vale Dorn. Sir. Report, Commander. Sir, I recommend immediate revision of the Dominion engine's assessment parameters for the human species. A pause. The engine shows pacification at 61% completion. The engine's data inputs are compromised, sir. We believe our communications have been monitored since Cycle 4. The 61% figure is based on controlled zone telemetry that may have been deliberately manipulated. A longer pause. Manipulated by whom? Their governments collapsed in Cycle 2. There is no command structure. That is correct, sir. There is no command structure. He paused. I believe that is the point. Part 5. The Reckoning, minutes 23 to 25. On Cycle 14, the day the Dominion engine had projected full pacification, the Valdris fleet received a transmission. Not from a government. Governments had indeed collapsed, just as projected. Not from a military command. There was no unified military command structure left on Earth, just as projected. The transmission came from one voice, on a frequency the Valdris had spent 11 days trying and failing to locate. Short, clear, in perfect standard Valdris, spoken by someone who had apparently learned the language in the past 2 weeks. You came to a world and expected to find what you've always found. You found something else. We're giving you a choice, a courtesy you didn't extend to the 412 worlds before us. Pause. Leave. Another pause, shorter. Your fleet, your forces, everything you brought. You have 72 hours. We will not interfere with your withdrawal. We will not fire on your ships. We will not pursue. And then, the sentence that made every Valdris officer who heard the transmission go very, very still. But if you are still here in 72 hours, we will stop being restrained. Sarath-ul looked at his command council. They looked back at him. Nobody spoke for a very long time. Because the thing that turned the transmission from a bluff into something else, something credible, something that sat in the chest like a cold stone, was everything that had happened in the previous 11 cycles. 17 soldiers returned in their underwear, alive as a message. Soldiers disappearing from cleared zones with no trace. Patrols convinced they were being watched before anything happened. A food depot left intact specifically to be uncertain about. A communications frequency found in a gap in their own scanning pattern. All of it restrained. All of it calibrated. Every action designed not to maximize casualties, but to maximize psychological effect, which meant the people behind it were entirely capable of deciding what level of force to apply, which meant restrained was a real description, which meant what came after restrained was real too. Sarath-ul looked at the Dominion engine's current output. It had stopped producing confidence intervals 6 cycles ago. The data was too noisy. It was returning a status it had never returned in 412 campaigns. Insufficient pattern data. unable to project. He looked at it for a long time. Then he opened the fleet-wide command channel. All units, this is Commander Sarath Ul. Begin withdrawal protocols. They left in 61 hours, 11 hours ahead of the deadline. Nobody discussed that detail in the debrief. It wasn't the kind of thing Valdris commanders put in reports. Back on the human side, in a tunnel beneath a city that was just beginning to understand that the ships in orbit were moving, Colonel Vasquez looked at the sensor feed on a small captured Valdris display and watched the fleet begin to pull back. Nobody in the tunnel cheered. Nobody celebrated. Park looked up from the piece of equipment he was still out of what appeared to be pure professional interest, reverse engineering. Osei tilted her head slightly, the way she did when she was recalculating something. Varenkov opened his eyes from his rest position, observed the display for exactly 3 seconds, and closed them again. Vasquez looked at the feed a moment longer, then she turned back to the room. When the last ship clears sensor range, she said, then we go home. Nobody argued with that. They waited. 3 months later, in a different part of the galaxy, Supreme Executor Vale Dorn was called before the Valdris High Command to explain the first failed pacification in the history of the Dominion. He brought the Dominion engine's final output, the sensor logs, every report from every ground commander. He laid it all out, methodically, in the precise and detailed manner of a man who had spent a long time understanding exactly what had happened and was not looking forward to explaining it. The High Command listened. When he was done, the eldest of them, a figure whose service record stretched back 100 years and spanned wars that had made the Valdris what they are, asked a single question. You're telling me we lost to 12 people? Vale Dorn considered the precise accuracy of that statement. No, sir, he said. We lost to what 12 people are. There's a difference. The elder looked at him for a long time. Update the engine, she said finally. Add a new category. What category? She looked at the planet's designation on the tactical display. The small, oxygen-rich world in a minor spiral arm. The young species. The divided civilization. The primitive weapons. Unprojectable, she said. And for the first time in the history of the Valdris Dominion, a world in their catalog was marked not as pacified, not as pending, not as contested, but as do not engage. Somewhere in a tunnel beneath a rebuilding city, a woman with no public records and 3 passports read the final intelligence report, confirming the Valdris had left the solar system entirely. She set it down. She made coffee. The war, if it had ever really been a war, was over. It had lasted 14 cycles. Just like the engine predicted, for entirely the wrong reasons. The door was 11 meters tall. Not because the Vethrani were 11 meters tall, they weren't. They stood barely 2 meters at full height, slender as winter branches, with 4 eyes arranged in a slow vertical line down a face that looked like sculpted ash. The door was 11 meters tall because the Vethrani believed that the size of an entrance reflected the importance of what lay behind it. And the Galactic Immigration Bureau was, in their considered opinion, the most important building in the known universe. Ambassador Lena Vasquez stood at the base of those doors and stared up at them. She had been standing there for 40 minutes. The doors had not moved. The guards flanking them, 2 Vethrani soldiers in pale ceremonial armor, had not moved either. They hadn't even blinked. She wasn't sure they could blink. She hadn't been able to confirm that yet. 40 minutes standing on the crystalline plaza of Veth Prime, under a sky that was the wrong shade of blue, too green at the edges, like a bruise healing in the wrong direction, holding a briefcase that contained 6 years of work, 12,000 pages of documentation, and the formal application of the human species for membership in the Galactic Union. Behind her, the rest of the delegation waited in careful silence. Dr. Oren Kafi, humanity's lead xenodiplomacy specialist, stood with his hands folded behind his back, watching the back of Lena's head the way a man watches a grenade he's already thrown. Beside him, Colonel Yara Solis, technically present as a security liaison, practically present because someone in the UN had decided that soldiers made governments feel better, stood at parade rest, her expression arranged into something that communicated professional patience and not at all the deep, simmering impatience underneath it. The fourth member of the delegation, a young translator named Pell, was trying very hard not to look at the guards. He was failing. They unsettled him in a way he couldn't name. There was something wrong with how still they stood. Humans fidgeted. Humans shifted their weight and scratched their noses and blinked too much when they were nervous. These guards stood like objects, like furniture that had been built to look like soldiers. Lena pressed the communication panel on the door for the 7th time. The chime rang. Hollow. Musical. Completely ignored. "They know we're here," Oren said quietly, stepping up beside her. "They've known we were here for 40 minutes, Lena replied. "It could be a test. Everything is a test with them." She pressed the panel an 8th time. "The question is whether standing here and pressing this button is passing or failing." Colonel Solis spoke without moving her eyes from the guards. "In my experience, waiting outside a door for 40 minutes while armed personnel ignore you is rarely a sign that things are going well." The shuttle ride back to the orbital station was quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of people who had nothing to say, but the tense quiet of people who had too much to say and were waiting for the right moment to say it. Lena sat near the viewport and watched Veth Prime shrink below them, a pale, delicate world of white stone and silver water, and cities that looked, from orbit, like scattered jewelry. It was a beautiful planet, and she had spent months learning about it. Its history, its culture, its art, its centuries-long tradition of cautious, measured diplomacy. The Vethrani had been members of the Galactic Union for 400 years, respected and influential, and the Bureau of External Relations had been their idea. They had built the system that had just rejected humanity's application. They believed in it. That was the part that was hardest to be angry about. When Oren finally broke the silence, naming the 17 grounds aloud, Lena cut him off gently. She knew, she said, and she knew about the trade threshold too. What mattered now was what came next. They would go home, report, regroup, and come back. Not through the appeals process, which could take 40 to 80 years, but through something else. Something she didn't have a name for yet, but intended to find. On Earth, the rejection landed like a stone in quiet water, its ripples spreading in every direction. The isolationists said they'd told everyone so. The pragmatists called the timeline unfortunate but manageable. A smaller, quieter group, the one Lena found herself drawn toward, argued that the requirements were designed to exclude, that the Union hadn't admitted a new member in 60 years, that the self-referential prerequisites weren't oversight, but a deliberate filter. Lena requested a second mission within 3 weeks of returning home. That request was denied. She requested a meeting with Secretary General Nwosu instead, and spent 4 hours making the case that standard diplomacy wasn't going to work, that the Union's charter contained emergency provisions allowing a current member species to sponsor a provisional track that bypassed the standard prerequisites entirely. Nwosu listened without interrupting, then asked the only question that mattered. Which member would do that? Lena told her she was working on it, which was, at the time, aspirationally true. The thread she'd found led to the Durath, a quiet and methodical people who traded in biological data and pharmaceutical compounds, and had no particular strong feelings about human union membership, which meant they might be persuadable. Over 6 weeks, she built a relationship with their cultural attaché, Sis Varen, sending everything: Earth's history, its art, its science, its embarrassing centuries of conflict, and the hard, imperfect structures it had built to end them, and making no attempt to oversell. She simply made the case that humanity deserved the chance to try. SS Varen's replies came slowly, every 5 to 12 days, and Lena answered each one within hours. This went on for 3 months, until a Tuesday morning in March brought a message only 2 sentences long. The Durath Biological Cooperative was prepared to offer provisional sponsorship, subject to one condition. The condition, it turned out, was not what she expected. The condition came attached to a briefing document that Lena read 3 times before she fully processed what she was looking at. A Durath deep space survey vessel, operating near the outer boundary of Union-charted space, had detected an anomaly in a region that was supposed to be empty, a pattern in the background radiation with the kind of structure that meant intention. After 6 weeks of careful listening, they understood what it was: a weapon, not fired and not ancient, but actively being assembled in the dark between stars by a species the Union's records listed as believed extinct. The Kaveth had been founding members of the Union 700 years ago, then expelled, the historical records selectively redacted, leaving only the outcome, after which they had vanished from known space entirely. The survey vessel's discovery suggested they had not gone as far as everyone assumed. The trajectory analysis, run 16 times because the first 15 answers were too terrible to immediately believe, pointed the weapon at one specific target: Veth Prime. The Durath were afraid in a way that lived below the level of words, and what they needed from humanity, in exchange for sponsorship, was speed. The Union's consensus requirement for military deployment could take 2 years. They needed someone who could move faster than that. Lena called Secretary General Nwosu within the hour. The Durath estimated 14 months before the weapon reached operational capacity. 3 had already passed, leaving 11. Nwosu asked whether the Vethrani had been told, and Lena explained that the Durath didn't believe they would act in time through official channels. The question became what humanity could do, and what doing it would cost. Lena negotiated a written guarantee from SS Varen, sponsorship regardless of outcome so long as humanity made a genuine attempt, and had it in hand within 48 hours. The ship they sent was the UNSS Meridian, chosen not for size or firepower but for 3 specific qualities. It was fast, it was quiet, and its captain, Commander Dara Ose, had a record of doing the right thing in situations where the right thing was genuinely unclear. Lena went with it, over Nwosu's firm suggestion that she stay on Earth, on the grounds that having diplomatic authority present would be considerably more efficient than routing critical decisions through a 4-day communication lag. Nwosu had looked at her for a long moment and said, "Don't get killed." Lena had taken that as approval. The transit took 18 days, which Lena spent in briefings with Ose and the tactical team, running scenarios and mapping variables until there were no questions left to ask. On the 14th day, Ose raised the one that had been sitting beneath everything. Why were the Kaveth pointing a weapon specifically at the Vethrani? Lena gave the answer she'd been carrying since she first read the briefing. The Vethrani had built the bureau, the membership system, the requirements that determined who belonged and who didn't. The Kaveth had been expelled through that very system by their former partners. 700 years of grudge had an architecture, even if it didn't have a justification. On the 18th day, the Meridian dropped out of FTL and the sensors went quiet, in the way they go quiet when they've found something enormous and cold and thoroughly non-reflective. The structure extended across nearly 400 kilometers of space, and its power readings were orders of magnitude beyond what the survey vessel had recorded 3 months earlier. It had been building faster than the Durath knew. The tactical officer ran the numbers twice and reported in the careful, steady voice of someone delivering bad news to people who need to stay calm. At current accumulation rate, the weapon would reach firing threshold in approximately 63 days. They couldn't destroy it alone. But its core node, where the primary power conduits converged, was oriented defensively outward, toward Union space, leaving a window for something that was already close enough to get inside. 63 days to get the Union to authorize a military response, through a process that took between 4 months and 2 years. Ose turned to Lena and asked what their other options were. The message went to Sareveth Dolan, not through official channels, not to the Union's military council, but directly to the third secretary who had stood in the doorway 11 months ago and listed 17 reasons why humanity didn't belong. Lena chose him deliberately. She had read his file carefully enough to know he was not a politician, but a genuine bureaucrat, someone who believed in the system he served and had spent 40 years trying to make it work correctly, and who had argued unsuccessfully that the biological survey requirement was logistically unreasonable, then implemented it anyway because he believed in the system even when it was wrong. He was the kind of person who, shown something real and terrible, would do something about it. She wrote him the most honest thing she had ever put in writing: where the meridian was, what it was looking at, what it would do in 63 days, and what humanity could do to stop it if the Vethrani were willing to move within 72 hours. She told him about the Durath intelligence and the Kaveth and her theory about the grudge. She told him she understood, in the small way she was able to, something about what a door that wouldn't open felt like. She told him the meridian could reach the core node in 18 hours at maximum speed, and that the plan would work if the Vethrani could provide a distraction, a show of force at the outer perimeter, enough to pull the weapon's defensive attention outward long enough for the meridian to get inside. She told him she was asking him to trust her. The response came in 4 hours and 11 minutes. "We are mobilizing 18 hours, do not be late," signed not with his title, but with his name alone. The next 18 hours were the longest of Lena's life. The meridian ran dark and fast, its engines pushed to the edge of rated capacity, while Osei's team ran the approach simulation 19 times and found 3 problems, fixed 2, and decided the third would have to be handled in the moment. At the edge of detection range, something was happening at the weapon's outer perimeter. The Vethrani had come, not just the planetary defense fleet, but the full forward naval force, 17 vessels appearing simultaneously out of FTL in a coordinated emergence pattern the weapon's defensive architecture had never been designed to face. The power readings shifted, the careful, patient accumulation redirecting toward defense, and for a window of approximately 4 minutes, the core node went from heavily defended to merely guarded. Osei said now. The Meridian Dove. In the official accounts, the next 11 minutes were described in clean tactical language. Approach vector, ordnance deployment, structural failure cascade, confirmation of core node destruction. The people who had been there described it differently in the months afterward. They described the weapon coming apart not explosively but slowly, like a held breath finally released. 400 kilometers of construction, 700 years in the making, becoming 400 kilometers of debris drifting quietly into the permanent dark. Lena sent a single short message. "It's done." Sarev's reply arrived 40 minutes later, requesting the honor of her presence at her earliest convenience to review some documentation. She read it 3 times and then she started laughing. The real kind, the kind that comes up from somewhere deep when something has been held tight for a very long time and is finally allowed to let go. The provisional membership ceremony was held not in the Bureau of External Relations, but in the Hall of Founding, a space reserved for moments the Union considered significant enough to require its oldest room, its walls carrying the marks of 4 centuries of decisions and alliances and crises navigated. Sarev read the declaration in Vethrani, then in the Galactic Common Tongue, then, in a gesture not required by protocol, in English, spoken carefully with strong accent and imperfect rhythm, but with each word placed with the deliberate intention of someone who had practiced. He reminded her that provisional status was not full membership, and that the standard track would still need to be completed. She told him the Durath had offered to help revise the biological survey methodology. He tilted his head in the gesture she had finally decoded, with Cess Varen's help, as something close to approval. Then he extended his hand, a human gesture he had looked up and practiced and decided was the right thing to do. And she shook it. When she asked whether he had thought humanity would come back, he said he had hoped so, though he had not been certain. What had made him hope? She asked. He told her she had pressed the communication panel 8 times before he opened the door. The record before her had been 4. Most applicants pressed it twice. The door had never been locked, he said. It never was. It required only persistence to open. And 8 times had suggested to him that her species might have the necessary quantity of that. He turned back to the assembled dignitaries and the cameras transmitting to 8 billion people, who had been told this moment would not happen in their lifetimes. Lena looked down at the document in her hands. Outside, the sky was the wrong shade of blue. She was beginning to like it.